Thank you all, and thank you all for attending. For those I've not met, I'm Joe Kaderavek, the CEO of Cobalt Blue, and I appreciate your time. I'm keeping you all from your lunch, but in exchange for that, I'll introduce you to our in-house thoughts about the cobalt market and about Cobalt Blue itself. So let's kick off with the cobalt market. Batteries today consume 50% of cobalt demand. So let's put that in perspective. Lithium-ion cells were only commercialised in the mid-90s by Panasonic, and it was only in the last 10 years that the first discernible demand drivers came through in cobalt. So what you're seeing today in the cobalt market didn't exist 10 years ago in any major form. So in 10 years, batteries are now occupying 50% of that market. If I look at this chart, you'll see on the left-hand side, this is where batteries have come from. These are small cells growing at GDP-like growth, typically consumer electronics. The future, however, is very, very exciting. As an engineer, what I'm really excited about here is that cobalt has a secure place in batteries where energy density, power transmission, and life cycle all count. And that, in a nutshell, is electric vehicles. And that, in a nutshell, is the bull argument for cobalt. That was an argument that Warwick had made this morning as well. The future is large batteries growing at well above GDP rates. Just very briefly on the cobalt market itself, on the battery market itself, if you want lithium-ion exposure, you've effectively got to get it from one of these three elements, lithium, cobalt or graphite. And between the two, cobalt has a far different supply scenario with a very fragile 3 to 4% supply forecast. And if I just look at EVs, for example, I touched on earlier, if electric vehicles penetrate just 1% of the global vehicle mass by 2020, that'll put a staggering 40% demand CAGR into the cobalt market. Market forecast itself, we believe that cobalt will be in around about the 9% CAGR range for the next 5 years and beyond, against a fragile 3 to 4% supply growth. What you've seen in the cobalt market is effectively a doubling in the last 18 months, but we believe that number is sustainable, indeed has upside risk. Now let me show you what I call the money slide. If you were bullish about cobalt coming into this presentation, this will certainly help you out. Firstly, 98% of all cobalt is a byproduct of either copper or nickel. And that's a really critical point. This is a byproduct metal we're talking about. So for 98% of producers, cobalt represents only between 15 and 30% of their revenue line. In other words, they're beholden to copper or nickel to make their operations work. In the backdrop of that, against that supply, 60% of it comes from one country in Africa, the DRC, a country replete with high sovereign risk as well as questionable ethical mining practices. So we asked our consultants, break down the nickel and copper market for us and tell me what natural supply of cobalt is inherent in those markets. If we look at nickel over here, because the marginal supplier in nickel today is typically an Indonesian nickel pig iron supplier, potentially some Filipino nickel pig iron coming in as well, that has zero cobalt content in it. So maybe the market in nickel can supply around 1.5% plus natural cobalt credits to the market going forward. If we look at copper, the natural marginal suppliers in the copper market tend to be the South American copper moly style ores. So it's the Escondida extension, it's Los Bombos, it's Spence ramping. Even Freeport underground is a non-cobalt bearing ore. So the copper coming into the market has very little cobalt in it. And as a result, we believe that the natural supply chain that exists, the byproduct supply chain of cobalt, is very fragile. Cobalt Blue is unique. We are a primary cobalt asset. We are not beholden to co-products. If I can introduce my business to you, we listed in February. We're a spin-out effectively from Broken Hill Prospecting, who presented earlier. And we're a fit-for-purpose vehicle looking to develop the world-class Thakkaringa asset. I can say confidently after we've concluded our 2016 and first half 17 drill campaign, which totalled nearly 8,000 metres, if you can find a more committed cobalt explorer, you should invest in them, because no one else is doing the level of work that we are currently. Overall, our near-term target is to significantly expand our resource to a world-class level, and that statement will be released to the market in around 4 weeks' time. The resource is targeted to support a 20-year top 10 mine life. By mid-year, in conjunction with that resource statement, we'll be releasing a scoping study, the first of our engineering studies. I'm excited that in 14 months' time, we'll be releasing a preliminary feasibility study, as well as a tighter resource definition at that stage. By mid-2019, our focus is on a full BFS, a full reserve statement, and all the associated stakeholder approvals to get us ready for decision to mine and project financing. Our drill program remains largely very successful. What you're seeing is excellent results, broad intersection, very broad intersection of very high-grade mineralisation. I will take, in the interest of time, the drill results and the program offline. More than happy to discuss those in the booth. Now let me talk to you why I'm so bullish about Thakkaringa's cost. Thakkaringa has significant cost advantages. Firstly, we're targeting ridge lines in our mining campaign, so this is an exposed ore. All we need to do is get rid of the oxide, and typically 20, 30 metres below that we have fresh sulphides to mine. We're located just 23 kilometres from Broken Hill. You can see the main highway there. And so from a labour perspective, that's a 20,000 person mining centre that's there already in place, with the right skills and numbers to build, operate and maintain the mine. Putting that in broad perspective, that's a 20-minute commute for our workplace. That's less than I have in my commuters in Sydney. The same highway will support building materials and consumables, and you can see in the diagram a 220 kV substation. Well, that's the national grid, that's the NEM. I can tap into mains power to do all of my heavy handling on site. If you're a financial analyst, I'd pitch it this way. That's 8 cents a kilowatt hour across 30 megs to do all of my heavy lifting on site. It's a very, very cost-effective operation. Additionally, we have water, which is being conveniently upgraded by the New South Wales Government as part of the Murray to Broken Hill pipe. And lastly, we have the crown in the jewel, which is a railway you can see on the diagram, plus also in the inset, which will take our product to deepwater port at Port Pirie, some 400 kilometres away. So whilst we benefit from the infrastructure at Broken Hill, which BHP and others have put in place before us, it's our view to use 21st century sorting and processing technologies to create a very, very high margin cobalt-focused operation. A little bit of intelligence on some recent commercial visits we've undertaken. My chairman and I recently visited China. We did quite a gruelling 4-province, 3,000 kilometre trip. We visited the 4 largest cobalt refineries in China, some 80% of Chinese production, and we were very impressed by the strong appetite they had to diversify out of the DRC, diversify out of the Congo. It's seen as a very, very big risk to the industry. We also talked about pricing. Their feedback to us is that $25 a pound, where we are today, is largely sustainable. However, any increase in the price from here on could see thrifting, in other words, battery makers starting to thrift on the cobalt content going forward. But overall, it was seen that today's price was sustainable. Lastly, we were very impressed with their world-class R&D, which we hope to piggyback on when we develop our mine. Let me come to a landing by introducing the Cobalt Blue management team and the board. Firstly, who are we? Our chairman is Rob Biancardi, who's here in the crowd. He's a successful businessman with a history of bringing companies to listing as both a CEO and chairman, most recently in tech and healthcare. Rob brings non-traditional investors onto our register. Secondly, we have Trangi Johnson, who presented this morning. He's the CEO of Broken Hill Prospecting. He's a CEO and experienced field geologist in his own right. He brings strong industry knowledge as well as connections to the board. Hugh Keller is also another non-exec, a former managing partner of one of Australia's largest corporate law firms, brings his legal skill set. And lastly, myself, I'm an aeronautical engineer of all things. I've seen cobalt in airframes and gas turbines. I've had 8 years with Rio and BHP in open cut, 5 years as head of resources at Deutsche, and 15 years in investment management in lithium ion and energy storage. So I've got a fair bit of background in this space. I thank you all for your time. If you've got time later this afternoon, please come and see us. We're at stand 40. Thank you.